I still remember my wedding day like it just happened. Everything felt perfect, but I kept hearing a strange voice in my head saying something is wrong. Emily said, "Ethan, you are too quiet today." I smiled and told her I was just nervous because I wanted everything to be perfect for us. Ryan laughed and said, "Weddings always make people crazy, bro, relax." I said, "Nothing is wrong, I just feel something strange, like I am missing something." During the reception everyone kept congratulating me and I kept forcing a smile while searching for Emily. Ryan told me she went upstairs to rest and I believed him without thinking too much. I said okay, maybe she is just tired, but my heart did not agree. Night came and I walked toward the honeymoon suite feeling nervous for no reason. I opened the door and called out Emily, but there was no answer. I said, "Emily, are you here? This is not funny anymore." I stepped inside slowly and felt the air colder than outside. Then I saw the mirror with words written on it. The message said I never belonged here. My hands started shaking and I could not breathe properly. I called Emily again and again, but her phone was off. I shouted, "Ryan, where is she? Tell me the truth now." He did not answer and I felt my world breaking apart. I sat on the bed and whispered, "This cannot be happening to me." I said, "Emily, please come back, I need you." Ryan finally texted me saying she left the hotel. I stared at the screen and felt like I was dying inside. I said out loud, "This is not possible, she would not do this." I walked out of the room with shaking legs and empty heart. Outside everyone was still laughing like nothing had happened. I wanted to scream but no sound came out of my mouth. I whispered, "This wedding is over," in my mind. I stood there alone realizing my life had just changed forever. Mark came to me and asked, "What happened, bro? You look pale." I said, "I cannot find Emily, she is gone." He said, "Maybe she is just upstairs, calm down." I said, "No, something is wrong, I feel it." Ryan walked past me without looking in my eyes. I grabbed him and asked, "Where is she, Ryan?" He said, "I do not know," and left quickly. I felt betrayal, but I still did not understand it fully. I went back to the room again hoping she would appear. The mirror message was still there like a wound. I touched it and felt my hands go cold. I said, "This cannot be real, this is a nightmare." I sat again and stared at the empty room. I whispered, "Emily, why did you leave me?" Outside music kept playing like nothing had changed. I realized my perfect day had turned into a nightmare. I walked out slowly feeling like I had lost everything. Mark followed me and said, "Bro, sit down, you are shaking." I said, "I need answers, not comfort right now." He said, "Then we will find her together." I nodded, but inside I felt a storm growing. I looked at the crowd and felt completely alone. I said under my breath, "This is not the end." I walked toward the exit without looking back. I promised myself I will find the truth no matter what. The night air hit my face as I stepped outside the hotel. I looked at the lights and felt my life breaking inside. I whispered, "Emily, I will not stop until I know everything." Mark placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "We are with you." I said, "Then let us begin, because my life just ended tonight." I walked forward knowing nothing would ever be the same again. I clenched my fists and told myself I will turn pain into strength. I looked back one last time at the hotel and swore I would uncover every truth hidden there. I walked into the dark road ready for whatever came next in my life. I will never trust again. I woke up and said, "Emily," but the room stayed silent. I sat up fast and called the front desk, "Is my wife there?" She never came back last night. The receptionist said, "Sir, there is no record of her checking in this morning." My heart dropped. I said, "Check again please, this is my wedding hotel." She replied, "I already checked twice, sir." I hung up and whispered, "This cannot be real." I rushed outside and saw Robert standing near the hall. I asked him, "Where is Emily? Tell me now." He said calmly, "She needed space. Don't panic." I said, "Space? On our wedding night?" Laura avoided my eyes and said, "Maybe she was overwhelmed." I stepped closer and said, "You both know something." Robert replied, "Stop creating drama." Ryan came in and said, "Bro, relax, she just went somewhere to clear her head." I shouted, "Stop lying to me." Ryan said, "Why would I lie?" I said, "Because you were the last one seen with her." He laughed nervously and said, "That's nonsense." I grabbed my phone and said, "I need CCTV footage right now." The manager said, "Only police or family head can request that." I said, "Then call whoever you need." After an hour, I watched the footage with shaking hands. I saw Emily walking out with Ryan late at night. I whispered, "No, this is not possible." Ryan stood beside me and said, "What are you looking at?" I showed him the screen and said, "Explain this." He said, "I don't know what this is." I said, "You are right there with her." He shouted, "That's edited." I felt my body freeze and said, "You betrayed me." He said, "I did nothing wrong." I left the room and called Emily again and again. Her phone stayed off. Mark came and said, "You look destroyed, what happened?" I said, "She left with him." He said, "We will find her." I said, "I already saw it, Mark." He asked, "Saw what?" I said, the footage? Ryan was with her. He said, then we need answers fast. I nodded and said, something is being hidden from me. Laura walked past and whispered, not everything is what it seems. I said, then tell me the truth. She said nothing and walked away. I stood alone and said, I am not stupid. My hands were shaking again as I replayed the footage in my mind. I whispered, Emily, why did you do this? I walked back to the room and saw the empty bed again. I said, this wedding is turning into a nightmare. Ryan texted me, stop accusing me. I replied, prove your innocence then. He didn't respond. I sat down and said, I will uncover everything. I looked at the mirror message again in my mind. I said, this is only the beginning. Mark said, we should go to the police. I replied, not yet, I need more proof first. He said, you are thinking too much emotionally. I said, no, I am thinking like someone who was betrayed. My phone rang and I saw an unknown number. I answered, who is this? A voice said, if you want truth, stop trusting everyone. I said, tell me who you are. The call ended immediately. Mark said, that was strange. I said, everything is strange since last night. I walked outside and looked at the hotel gate. I said, she walked out from here and never looked back. Mark asked, what now? I said, now I find every second of her movement. He said, and Ryan? I said, he is lying. I will prove it. I clenched my fists and said, no one will escape from this. Laura appeared again and said, truth always comes out in its own time. I said, then I will speed up time. She looked at me and said nothing again. I whispered, Emily, I trusted you with my life. I turned away and said, not anymore. Mark placed hand on shoulder saying we will uncover truth step by step, and I nodded saying I will not stop until I see everything clearly and make everyone responsible face consequences for what they did. I walked into Robert's office and said, I need answers about Emily. Robert looked at me and said, move on, Ethan. She made her choice. I said, that is my wife you are talking about. He replied, was your wife? I felt my chest tighten and said, stop playing with words. Laura stood near the window and said softly, you should sit down. I said, not until someone tells me the truth. Robert said, truth is simple. She left. I said, she didn't just vanish. Laura avoided my eyes and said, maybe she was never fully happy. I turned to her and said, what do you mean by that? She said, you deserve honesty. I said, then give it. Robert said, enough, Laura. I said, no, let her speak. Laura said, Emily felt trapped sometimes. I said, trapped with me? She nodded slightly. I felt anger rising and said, that is not true. Robert said, you are wasting time. I said, I am finding truth. I left the office and called Mark. I said, meet me now. We need to dig into everything. Mark said, I already started. I said, what did you find? He said, bank records. Strange transfers. I said, from Emily? He said, from both Emily and Ryan. I stopped walking and said, explain. He said, money moved before wedding. I said, so this was planned. He said, looks like it. I felt my hands shake and said, they used me. Mark said, we need proof. I said, I will get it. I went back home and checked my laptop. I said, show me everything, Ryan. Files opened and I saw messages. I whispered, no, this cannot be real. Ryan wrote, after wedding we leave clean. Emily replied, just wait for timing. I stood up and said, you planned this together. My voice shook as I said, all of it was fake. Mark said over phone, what did you see? I said, everything. He said, then what now? I said, now I stop being silent. I closed laptop and said, no more lies. Laura called me and said, truth is heavier than you think. I said, I can carry it. She said, can you handle consequences? I said, watch me. I sat alone and said, Emily, why did you do this to me? Mark said, we are close to something big. I said, then we go all the way. I stood up and said, no turning back now. Mark called again and said, Ethan, I found something worse. I said, tell me now. He said, Ryan booked a private room the night before wedding. I said, with who? He said, Emily. I closed my eyes and said, so it was real. Mark said, there is more. CCTV got wiped. I said, someone is hiding everything. He said, we should go to police now. I said, not yet. I need Ryan in front of me. Laura texted me, you are walking into fire. I replied, I already burned. She said, then stop before you lose yourself. I said, I already lost everything. Mark said, meet me tonight. I said, I will. I looked at old wedding photo and said, you smiled at me while planning betrayal. I whispered, why did I trust you? I grabbed my phone and said, Ryan, meet me or I expose everything. No reply came. I said, silence means guilt. Mark said, be careful, he is dangerous now. I said, so am I now. I sat in silence and said, everything is falling into place but I still need his face in front of me. Mark said, then tonight we finish this. I said, if he lies again I will expose everything publicly. Laura sent one last message saying, be careful, Ethan, revenge changes people. I replied, truth already changed me. I looked outside and said, no more running, no more waiting. Mark said, we meet at old warehouse. I said, I will bring proof and end this. I clenched my fist and said, Emily, Ryan, this ends now. I stood ready for confrontation. I walked into the night knowing nothing in my life would ever be the same again after tonight forever changed. I met Mark outside the station and said, I need every clue you have about Emily. Mark said, then stop waiting and start thinking like she planned something. I said, I already feel like everything was planned behind my back. Mark said, I found hotel logs showing repeated meetings between Emily and Ryan. I said, that cannot be true, she loved me. Mark said, you need to see the evidence yourself. I said, show me everything. Mark showed me screenshots and I said, this is killing me inside. I said, I remember her smile every single day. Mark said, that smile might have been fake. I said, no, she loved me. Mark said, love doesn't leave on wedding night. I said, I will confront Ryan. Mark said, be careful, he is unstable. I met Ryan and said, tell me the truth now. Ryan said, you already know part of it. I said, I want full truth. Ryan said, we were confused, it was not planned like you think. I said, confused? You destroyed my life. Ryan said, I didn't mean to hurt you. I said, but you did. Ryan said, it started as feelings, then got out of control. I punched Ryan and said, you ruined everything I had. Mark said, stop Ethan, police are coming. I said, I don't care anymore. Police said, step back now. I said, he destroyed my marriage. Mark said, calm down, we will handle this legally. I said, I trusted them both. Ryan said, I am sorry. I said, sorry is not enough. Police said, you are under arrest for assault. I said, I will prove the truth. Mark said, we will get you out. I said, I am not weak anymore. Ryan said, you don't understand everything. I said, I understand betrayal. Mark said, this is bigger than you think. I said, then I will expose it all. Ryan said, you will regret this. I said, no, you will. Mark said, enough, both of you. I sat in police van and said, this is just the beginning. Mark said, stay strong, I will help you. I said, I only want truth. Police said, we are processing case. I said, they planned everything. Mark said, we have proof now. I said, then use it. Ryan said, Emily will explain everything. I said, she already destroyed me. Mark said, this case is just starting. I said, I will not stop. Police said, you will be released soon. I said, I am already broken. Mark said, you are stronger now. I said, I don't feel it yet. Ryan said, you will understand later. I said, no, I understand now. Mark said, this changes everything. I said, then I change too. Police said, move to holding cell. I said, I will not forget this. Mark said, we are with you. I said, then I am not alone. Ryan said, this is not over. I said, it is for you. Mark said, Ethan, think carefully. I said, I already decided. Police said, case is registered. I said, then let it begin. Mark said, this will take time. I said, I have patience now. Ryan said, you will lose. I said, no, I already lost everything. Mark said, then rebuild. I said, from ashes. Police said, end of statement. I said, this night changed me forever. Mark said, I know. I said, I will find truth even if it destroys me. Police said, sit quietly. I said, I am already quiet inside. Mark said, we will fix this. I said, nothing can be fixed, only revealed. Ryan said, you are making mistake. I said, no, I am correcting it. Mark said, stay focused. I said, everything I believed was a lie. Mark said, now you know truth hurts. I said, it hurts but I will survive. Police said, case continues tomorrow. I said, tomorrow I face everything again. Mark said, I am staying with you. I said, that is enough for me. Ryan said, you don't know full truth. I said, then I will dig deeper. Mark said, be ready. I said, I am always ready now. Police said, end of night statement. I said, this is not my end. Mark said, it is your beginning. I said, then I will rise. Police said, move forward. I said, I lost trust, love, and peace, but I did not lose myself. Mark said, that is what matters now. I said, I will face everything and rebuild my life from nothing. I survived. I received a message and saw Laura's name on my phone. I said, why are you contacting me now? Laura replied, we need to talk in person. I said, I have nothing to say to you. She replied, you will change your mind after we meet. I stared at the screen and said, this family never stops hiding things. Mark said, don't go alone, this could be a trap. I said, everything already feels like a trap. I met Laura at a quiet cafe and said, talk fast. She said, you are angry, I understand. I said, no, you don't understand anything. She said, I knew about Emily and Ryan. I froze and said, you knew? She said, yes, for a long time. I said, and you said nothing? She said, it was not my place. I said, you ruined my life by staying silent. She said, your life was already being used. I said, explain what you mean. She leaned forward and said, this marriage was never just love. I said, what are you talking about? She said, it was business, control, and money. I said, stop speaking in riddles. She said, Robert used everyone, even Emily. I said, that's impossible. She said, nothing about this family is simple. I said, why are you telling me this now? She said, because you deserve truth. I said, or because you want something. She smiled slightly and said, smart question. I said, what do you want from me? She said, stay close to this family's business. I said, why would I help you? She said, because you are already inside their system. I said, I don't trust you. She said, you don't have to trust me, just see the truth. She handed me a file and said, open it when you are ready. I said, what is inside? She said, everything they tried to hide. I took the file and said, this could be fake. She said, check it yourself. I met Mark later and said, Laura gave me something. Mark said, do not open it yet. I said, I already know I will. I opened the file slowly and said, this is worse than I thought. Mark said, what do you see? I said, bank records, hidden transfers, fake contracts. Mark said, this is massive fraud. I said, so my marriage was part of this. Mark said, looks like you were used as cover. I said, they turned my life into a transaction. Mark said, we need lawyer help. I said, I want revenge first. Mark said, don't lose control. I said, I already lost control when she left me. Mark said, this is deeper than emotion. I said, then I will become deeper than them. I kept reading and said, Laura was right, this family is not normal. Mark said, be careful, she might still be manipulating you. I said, maybe, but she gave me truth. Mark said, truth always comes with a price. I said, I am ready to pay it. I looked at the papers and said, Robert is at the center of everything. Mark said, then he is your real target. I said, I don't even recognize my own life anymore. Mark said, that's what betrayal does. I said, it turns everything into enemies. Mark said, so what's your next step? I said, I go deeper into their company. Mark said, that is dangerous. I said, so is staying silent. I looked at Laura's file again and said, she opened a door I can't close now. Mark said, then walk through it carefully. I said, I will, but I won't be the same man. Mark said, you already changed. I said, I feel it. I closed the file and said, this family built lies on top of lies. Mark said, now you are standing on truth. I said, or standing in a war. Mark said, same thing sometimes. I said, if this is a game, I will learn every rule. Mark said, and then? I said, I will break them. Mark said, Ethan, be careful. I said, I have nothing left to lose. I looked at the city lights and said, from now on, I stop being the victim. Mark said, then who are you now? I said, I am the consequence of their choices. I walked into Mark's room and said, we need to go through everything again. Mark said, you are not sleeping again, are you? I said, sleep doesn't matter anymore. He said, you look like you are losing yourself. I said, I already lost myself the night she left. I opened Laura's file and said, let's see what else they hid. Mark said, be careful, this could break you more. I said, nothing is left to break. We started reading and I said, these contracts are fake. Mark said, no, they are structured mergers. I said, my marriage is in these papers. Mark said, not just marriage, your identity too. I said, explain. He said, you were selected for this deal. I froze and said, selected? Mark said, this wasn't random love. I said, stop saying that. He said, look at the signatures. I said, this is impossible. Mark said, Emily was assigned roles inside this structure. I said, you are telling me she was acting? He said, not acting, controlled. I said, controlled by who? He said, Robert. I sat down and said, so I was just a tool. Mark said, you were the cover for the merger. I said, they built my life like a contract. Mark said, and broke it when needed. I felt anger rising and said, I trusted them completely. Mark said, that's why it worked. I said, Ryan too? Mark said, he was part of the financial side. I said, so he didn't just betray me, he stole from me. Mark said, money was moved through fake deals. I said, this is disgusting. Mark said, we still don't have full proof. I said, then we get more. A knock came at the door and I said, who is it? A woman entered and said, I'm Sophie Lane. I said, lawyer? She said, yes, I handle corporate fraud cases. I said, I don't trust lawyers right now. She said, you don't need trust, you need strategy. I said, why are you here? She said, Laura sent me. I said, so she is still controlling things. Sophie said, no, she is helping you break it. I said, everyone says they are helping me. Sophie said, then let me show you something real. She placed documents on the table and said, this proves financial manipulation. I said, from the Carter Company? She said, yes, and Ryan's involvement is deeper than you think. I said, tell me everything. She said, money was moved before the wedding to protect assets. I said, and Emily? She said, she was forced into compliance. I felt my voice break and said, so she was never free. Sophie said, not in this structure. I said, then what was I? She said, a stabilizing asset in their merger plan. I stood up and said, I was used. Mark said, Ethan, breathe. I said, don't tell me to breathe. Sophie said, anger won't help you win. I said, then what will? She said, evidence and patience. I said, I don't have patience anymore. She said, then you will lose everything again. I looked at the papers and said, I already lost everything once. Mark said, use this chance properly. I said, I want justice, not survival. Sophie said, justice needs planning. I said, then I will plan everything. She said, good, because we start legal preparation now. I said, against Robert? She said, against the entire structure. Mark said, this is getting serious. I said, it was serious from the beginning. Sophie said, then act like it. I sat down and said, tell me what I need to do. She said, we build a case step by step. I said, and Ryan? She said, he will be key witness or target. I said, he destroyed my life. Sophie said, then let law handle it. I said, law didn't stop him before. She said, now it will. I looked at Mark and said, I am not the same man anymore. Mark said, no, you are sharper now. I said, I feel cold inside. Sophie said, that's focus, not weakness. I said, then I will use it. I closed the file and said, this marriage was a setup from day one. Mark said, now you know the truth. I said, now I start rebuilding justice. I walked into Sophie's office and said, file the case today. Sophie said, are you absolutely sure? I said, I have never been more sure in my life. Mark said, this will trigger everything. I said, that's exactly what I want. Sophie said, then we proceed against Ryan and the Carter Network. I said, and Robert too. She nodded and said, yes. I signed the papers and said, no more waiting. Mark said, this changes everything legally. I said, everything already changed emotionally. Sophie said, now it becomes public. I said, let it become public. Mark said, you are ready for backlash? I said, I survived betrayal, I can survive anything. Sophie said, then we move forward. I said, do it now. The next morning Mark called me and said, news is spreading. I said, already? He said, Carter Company stocks are dropping. I said, good. He said, Robert is calling emergency meetings. I said, let him panic. Mark said, Ryan's lawyer is responding. I said, they can't hide anymore. Sophie said over phone, the case is officially registered. I said, then there is no turning back. Later that day Mark said, someone wants to meet you. I said, who? He said, Emily. I froze and said, no. Mark said, she came herself. I said, where? He said, outside the building. I walked outside and saw her standing there. I said, why are you here? Emily said, Ethan, please listen. I said, I already heard enough in my life. She said, it wasn't what you think. I said, then explain the wedding night. She looked down and said, I was trapped. I said, everyone says that now. She said, my father controlled everything. I said, and Ryan? She said, he was part of it, but not everything. I said, you still left me. She said, I panicked. I said, you destroyed me. She stepped closer and said, I never stopped caring. I raised my hand and said, stop. She froze. I said, don't rewrite my pain. Emily said, I can fix this. I said, no, you can't. Mark said, Ethan, calm down. I said, I am calm. Emily said, please, just talk to me. I said, you had your chance. She said, I was forced into everything. I said, and silence was your choice. She started crying and said, I was scared. I said, so was I, but I stayed. Silence fell between us. I said, do you know what you took from me? She said nothing. I said, my trust, my peace, my future. Emily said, I am sorry. I said, sorry doesn't rebuild anything. Mark said, we should leave. I said, no, I am not done. Emily said, what do you want from me? I said, nothing anymore. She looked shocked and said, you don't love me? I said, I loved a version of you that didn't exist. She stepped back. I said, that version died on our wedding night. Emily said, Ethan, please. I said, go back now. She cried harder but didn't move. Mark said, Ethan, this is enough. I said, no, I need closure. I looked at her and said, you don't control my life anymore. She whispered, I lost everything too. I said, no, you walked away from everything. She lowered her head. I said, this conversation is over. Emily finally turned and left slowly. Mark said, are you okay? I said, no. He said, but you held your ground. I said, that's all I have now. Sophie called and said, Robert is preparing defense. I said, let him. She said, this is becoming war. I said, it already was. Mark said, power is shifting. I said, I can feel it. I looked at the building and said, now I control my path. I opened my phone and saw the headline and said, it has started. Mark said, Ryan lost his job already. I said, good, that's just the beginning. Sophie said, media is covering the case everywhere now. I said, let them see everything. Mark said, Robert is calling emergency board meetings. I said, his empire is shaking. Sophie said, evidence leaks are increasing pressure. I said, then keep leaking. Mark said, Emily tried calling you again. I said, I saw it. I ignored it. Mark said, she called 5 times. I said, I have nothing left to say to her. Sophie said, detachment is helping your focus. I said, it's helping my survival. Later Detective Jason Clark met me and said, we verified transactions. I said, between who? He said, Ryan and Robert linked accounts. I said, so it's real fraud. He said, large-scale financial manipulation. I said, I knew it. Mark said, this is enough for arrests. I said, not yet. Jason said, we still need final confirmation chain. I said, get it. Jason said, we are close. Mark said, you are staying calm surprisingly. I said, I am not calm. I am controlled. Sophie said, that's the right mindset. I said, what about Emily? Mark said, she keeps trying to reach you. I said, let her. Mark said, you won't respond? I said, no. Sophie said, you are closing emotional doors. I said, they were already broken. Mark said, Robert is losing investors fast. I said, everything is falling. Sophie said, Laura wants to meet you. I said, now. She said, urgent. I met Laura in a quiet room and said, why now? Laura said, because the truth is out. I said, I already know enough truth. She said, not all of it. I said, then speak. She said, I helped expose Robert. I froze and said, you did what? She said, I gave Sophie access to records. I said, so you were behind this too? She said, yes, but not for you at first. I said, explain. She said, Robert destroyed my life years ago. I said, and I was part of your revenge? She said, unknowingly, yes. I said, so I was used again. She said, not used, aligned. I said, same result. She said, but now you are winning. I said, I didn't start this war. She said, but you are ending it. I said, where is Ryan now? She said, lost, isolated, broke. I said, good. She said, Emily is also collapsing emotionally. I said, that's not my concern anymore. Laura said, you have changed completely. I said, you made me change. She said, no, Betrayal did. I said, what happens next? She said, final exposure phase. I said, meaning? She said, Robert's arrest is close. I said, finally. Mark called and said, Jason confirmed one more layer. I said, what now? He said, offshore accounts linked directly to Robert. I said, then it's over. Mark said, almost. Sophie said, we prepare court filing now. I said, do it. Laura said, you should prepare for backlash. I said, I already lost everything important. She said, then you are dangerous now. I said, good. Mark said, Emily is outside again. I said, tell her to leave. He said, she refuses. I walked out and saw her again and said, why are you still here? Emily said, I need to fix this. I said, you can't. She said, everything is falling apart. I said, it already fell when you left. She said, please listen. I said, I listened before and it destroyed me. Mark said, Ethan, don't reopen wounds. I said, they are already scars. Emily said, I am sorry for everything. I said, sorry is not currency. She cried and said, I lost everything too. I said, no, you lost comfort. I lost life. Silence fell. I said, this is your final warning. Stop coming back. Emily stepped back slowly. I said, leave now. She turned and walked away again. Mark said, you are shutting everything down. I said, I am finishing what started without me. Sophie said, court filing is ready. I said, then let justice begin. Mark said, this is the final phase. I said, no, this is the truth finally speaking. I was leaving Sophie's office when Mark said, she is inside waiting. I stopped and said, who? Mark said, Emily. I said, I told her not to come again. Mark said, she insisted this is the last time. I said, everything already ended. I walked inside and saw her standing there. I said, why are you still here? Emily said, I need to talk to you one last time. I said, you already said enough in my life. She said, please just listen. I said, speak fast. She said, I was pressured from every side. I said, so was I, but I stayed. She said, I was confused and scared. I said, confusion doesn't justify betrayal. She said, I never meant to hurt you. I said, but you did anyway. She started crying and said, I felt trapped in that life. I said, and I was trapped in loving you. She said, I tried to come back. I said, too late. She said, do you still hate me? I said, no. She looked surprised and said, then what do you feel? I said, nothing. Silence filled the room. Mark whispered, Ethan. I said, let me finish this. Emily said, I lost everything too. I said, no, you lost comfort. I lost truth. She said, Ryan is gone now. I said, he is arrested. Mark said, yes, police confirmed it this morning. I said, good. Emily said, my father ran away. I said, I know. Robert is out of the country. She said, I am alone now. I said, that was your choice long before today. She stepped closer and said, I still love you. I stepped back and said, don't say that. She said, it is true. I said, love doesn't disappear on wedding night. She said, I panicked. I said, and I broke. Mark said, Ethan, this is enough. I said, no, I need closure. I looked at her and said, you chose silence when I needed truth. She said, I was afraid. I said, fear is not an excuse. She said, can you ever forgive me? I said, forgiveness is not the problem. She said, then what is? I said, trust is dead. Her hands shook and she said, I don't know how to live without you. I said, you already did. Mark said, we should leave now. I said, one more thing. Emily looked up and said, what? I said, don't come back again. She said, is this really goodbye? I said, it ended the night you left. She cried harder but didn't speak. I said, Ryan is gone, Robert is gone, and I am gone too, for you. Emily whispered, I am sorry. I said, sorry doesn't rebuild a life. Silence stayed heavy between us. Mark said, Ethan, come on. I turned away and said, this is over. Emily said softly, I still see your face every night. I stopped but didn't turn back. I said, then learn to live with it. I walked out of the room. Mark followed and said, are you okay? I said, no. He said, but you stayed strong. I said, strength is all I have left. Outside, the air felt colder than before. Mark said, Ryan's court hearing is next week. I said, good. He said, Robert's case is international now. I said, then everything is falling into place. Mark said, Emily is broken now. I said, so am I, but I stopped showing it. He said, what happens next for you? I said, I rebuild, without any of them. Mark said, no revenge anymore? I said, justice already spoke for me. I looked back at the building and said, that was the last time I see her. Mark said, final closure? I said, final silence. I walked forward and said, now I live for myself only. I left the old company and said, I am done with all of this. I met Daniel Brooks and said, I need a fresh start. Daniel said, I heard your story. You are hired. I said, you don't even know me. He said, I know enough to trust you. I said, that is rare these days. I started working and said, this feels different. Nina Walker came later and said, you look like you never slept. I said, I stopped sleeping a long time ago. She said, then maybe it's time you start again. I said, I don't know how. She said, I can help you, but only if you want. I said, I want, but I don't trust easy anymore. Daniel said, trust is built, not given. I said, then start building. Months later I stood alone and said, everything changed. Nina said, you are quieter now. I said, I am not running anymore. She said, that is progress. I said, it doesn't feel like victory. Daniel said, peace is better than victory. I said, I still remember everything. Nina said, but it doesn't control you. I said, it used to. Daniel said, now you control yourself. I said, I finally feel something like peace. Nina said, you earned it. I said, not from revenge. Daniel said, from growth. I said, yes, from surviving everything. I thought revenge would fix me. Nina said, it only breaks you more. I said, it almost did. Daniel said, you stopped it in time. I said, I stopped when I had nothing left. Nina said, that is when people change. I said, I don't recognize who I was. Daniel said, that version is gone. I said, good, he was weak. Nina said, he was human. I said, I don't want to be that again. Daniel said, you are not. I said, then what am I now? Nina said, someone rebuilding. I said, I still carry pain. Daniel said, but it no longer carries you. I said, that is new. Nina said, and real. I said, I am afraid sometimes. Daniel said, that means you are alive. I thought I died that night she left. Nina said, you only broke. I said, breaking felt like dying. Daniel said, and rebuilding feels like living. I said, I want to keep living. Nina said, then you will. I said, I don't want my past controlling me anymore. Daniel said, then stop looking back. I said, I am trying. Nina said, then you are already winning. I never thought I would smile again. Daniel said, you are smiling now in a different way. I said, it feels strange. Nina said, strange is good. I said, I still think about Emily sometimes. Daniel said, that will fade. I said, not completely. Nina said, enough to not hurt. I said, I hope so. Daniel said, you built something new. I said, I built myself again. Nina said, stronger this time. I said, not stronger, just real. Daniel said, real is enough. I said, I forgive myself now. Nina said, that is biggest step. I said, not them, just me. Daniel said, that is peace. I finally understand everything ended for a reason. Nina said, to bring you here. I said, here feels quiet. Daniel said, quiet is good. I said, I am not the same man. Nina said, you shouldn't be. I said, I am grateful I survived. Daniel said, survival is victory. I said, then I won differently. Nina said, exactly. I said, no revenge saved me. Daniel said, only growth did. I said, I understand that now fully. Nina said, that is wisdom. I said, I will live quietly from now on. Daniel said, that is your real power. I said, I am no longer controlled. Nina said, freedom suits you. I said, I walk forward now. Daniel said, no more chains. I said, only my own path. Nina said, and you choose it. I said, I will never go back to who I was before all this. Daniel said, that chapter is closed forever. I said, I finally feel like I can breathe again without fear holding me down.